So today we will talk about Rene Descartes. Rene Descartes is a very, very important figure in philosophy. In fact, many classes actually begin with Rene Descartes. It depends on how your professor wants to start the class, but it's not uncommon to start with Descartes. Why would you start with Descartes rather than any other philosopher? Well, because he is really quintessential in terms of how modern philosophy began, how modern philosophy should be understood. And hopefully you'll see today why. Okay, so before we do that, as usual, let's go back a little bit and go over all these questions and see if you guys got the material from last time, especially since it's closely connected to what we will be talking about today. So starting with Copernicus. What did Copernicus do? Should be fairly easy answer. Yes, exactly. Good job. So yes, he did place the sun at the center instead of the Earth, which was a very important milestone. First of all, of course, in science, but also in philosophy, because as you will see later, Kant will do a similar thing in philosophy. Which philosophy had the most influence over Copernicus's astronomy? Why did he even think that it was a good idea? It's like connected. Both questions are connected. What gave him kind of a push to look at it in this way? Okay, so the answer here would be Neoplatonism. And remember why Neoplatonism, circle is the perfect shape. So those planets, if you do not put Earth, rather Sun at the center, it looks like they're making loops rather than circles. And if you place Sun at the center, then they are circling. Even though, like I said last time, it's not exactly circles, as we know today it's ellipses, but they still kind of circular shape rather than this weird loopy shape which they would have if you place Earth at the center. So that's exactly what gave him this push. How did Hobbes describe the process of human deliberation? So remember, after we talked about modern, early modern science, Copernicus and so on, we started talking about Hobbes, and one of the important reasons we did that is because Hobbes does kind of represent the reaction of philosophy to science. The discoveries in science kept on suggesting that the universe worked like a clockwork mechanism, and this is exactly why it's important to look at Hobbes a little bit, even though the book barely mentions Hobbes. But I thought more attention to Hobbes would be a good idea. So how does he describe the process of human deliberation? Anybody remembers that? Again, it is fairly easy. Yeah, it is predictable, but he actually gives kind of a better model of how it actually happens. Not only it's predictable, he's saying there's conflicting forces which working on us. Remember, he compared it to a yo-yo model. And then we are kind of swayed to different sides, but the physics of it essentially is what determines which way we eventually going to fall. So to say, like a yo-yo who is going like this and then eventually falls on one particular side. So same thing with human beings. The opposing forces, say two opposing forces, work on a human being, and then human being follows whichever one is stronger. Okay, what does Hobbes mean by the state of nature? Remember, in Leviathan, he starts with a state of nature. What exactly is he talking about? What is the state of nature? So then we are in a state of nature right now, Melissa? Because we do have a right for survival and being equal. Yeah, it is a state of fear, but like more specifically, what is the state of nature and the state of fear? The answer is the state of society, the state of rather humans before the society. It doesn't necessarily mean there was such a state, because we always had some form of society. It's doubtful that we ever had this kind of free-for-all type of environment, but possibly we did. It's kind of hard to predict that. As far as we know, in actual history, human beings always had some sort of small communities, be it family or whatever, and they followed certain rules. It's unlikely that there was ever this kind of free-for-all. Nonetheless, this is what Hobbes means. He suggests it as merely a thought experiment. And we will see a lot more of these thought experiments, because this is one of the favorite things philosophers always do. Descartes will also do that. But the idea is this: if you imagine human beings all pursuing their own goals and doing whatever they want, this is state of nature. This is what would be happening then. The state before the invention of society. What did Hobbes think human life would be like in that state without society? There's kind of a striking quote which we had last time. Anybody remembers? And yes, it is a state of fear, but he kind of gave a more graphic description than that. Well, that's more or less restating, but in the quote he said solitary, life would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. That's the answer, because remember, that's the direct quote. Kind of a more picturesque description of that state. And yes, it is true that it will be miserable, but that this is more what I expect on the exam. Okay, what limits should sovereign power have according to Hobbes? This is kind of an important question, and it's very easy to get it wrong. Absolute power, so in other words, what limits are there? No limits. That's the correct answer, because absolute power does mean no limits. So when the question is what limits should be there, the answer is no limits. No limits to power whatsoever, which may seem again a little bit weird to us. That's not how we typically think about it. But note that the point Hobbes is making is this. You have to have strong power. If you do not have strong power, everything collapses, things are even worse. So his answer actually to the question we were talking about last time, for example, when do people have a right to rebel against their government, his answer would be never. He'd say never. They never have this right. They should not. And you may say, well, how come? Why not? Hobbes would say, because things will get even worse. You think you will make them better by starting a revolution, but what you will actually get is civil war and collapse of the system. And then things will be worse. Of course, a lot of people would disagree with that, a lot of philosophers, but this is Hobbes' point. He's saying human beings cannot live without strong power. Any kind of power is better than no power at all. So even if you have some sort of a tyrant, a person who abuses power, well, wait till he dies or something. That's better than trying to overthrow him. Okay, so now we're going to proceed to early modern philosophy more generally. So what was the deal with early modern philosophy? One of the most important things, which we again touched on last time, they wanted to swipe out the past. Completely get rid of all this past stuff, including Aristotle's philosophy. And Aristotle's philosophy, as cool and interesting as it is, created a certain problem. Why did it create a problem? Because it was accepted as some sort of a teaching, as the holy teaching of some sort. Remember, even though scholastics were working with trying to adapt it to Bible and kind of merge them in some sense. But what was problematic is they were not really questioning either the Aristotle or the Bible. They thought both of them somehow can just work together. Aristotle was the philosopher and the Bible was the holy teaching, and we just take them on authority and then we try to figure out how do they work together. But they did not question either one of them. So this is what is specifically different about early modern philosophy, questioning the authority, any authority. Just trying to use your reason rather than authority itself. In medieval philosophy, authority was very important. The Bible and the works of Aristotle and whatever else were, again, like I said, considered to be more or less unquestionable. Even though in some sense Aristotle wasn't working well with the Bible, but they were trying to find a way that you can somehow still accept it, be it the dual truth theory, it's like they both true, just in different way, or whatever else. Now, in modern philosophy, we do not see that, at least not much, even though it's pretty difficult to start everything from scratch, but you can, and this is exactly what Descartes will try to do. We'll see if he is successful or not. And again, like I mentioned last time, today, the way we do it in philosophy, we distinguish rationalists and empiricists among those philosophers. But always remember, important thing, they never thought of themselves as rationalists or empiricists. They just did philosophy. These words were never used. They were invented hundreds of years later, just for our convenience, to kind of help sort them out. But they do help, because they really do pick out something important. So what is important about these two movements, we may say, rationalists and empiricists? Now, we talked about empiricists last time because Hobbes is an empiricist. And generally in Great Britain, you will see more empiricists. They believe that everything we know comes a posteriori. A posteriori means after knowledge, after certain experience. So first you experience something, then you gain knowledge of it. That's the idea. How is it different with rationalists? Well, rationalists actually think that some knowledge is already there when we are born. It's like pre-installed software in a sense. It's in us. And we can actually know things a priori. A priori just basically means prior to. Prior to what? Prior to experience. Before we even have experience, we know things already. How do we know them? Because they're already there. Like I said, a good example for us today would be a computer with pre-installed software. Certain stuff's already there. You just bought it. You never touched it before. And it already knows things. How come? Well, because it's already there. So that's the idea with rationalists and empiricists. This is kind of a table explaining them. Rationalism mainly called continental. Why? Because it's on the continent, compared to empiricism, which is mostly British, so it's on the British Isles, right? Because Great Britain is actually an island. Now, who are the typical representatives for rationalism? The perhaps classic representative would be Descartes, then Spinoza and Leibniz, who we will not talk much in this class because we don't have enough time to cover all of them. This is typical representatives of what we call rationalism. Mainly it was centered in France, Holland, and Germany. That's why it's continental, it's on continent. And it actually has good roots there. Even today, continental philosophy is generally related to this stream of thought. Now, again, genuine knowledge to them has foundation in thought or reason, and therefore in your mind. You can find knowledge in your mind. Now, some of the examples, the triangle, all the angles of the triangle are 180 degrees. Note that the rationalist would tell you this is something you don't really need to find out by measuring the triangle. You already know that. By definition of triangle, you can figure it out. So note that it is related to philosophy of Plato. Remember, Plato also thought that these ideas of forms are kind of out there, and we don't really need any experience to know them because they are already in our memory, and when we are born we already have it because we lived before, and so this is kind of from previous lives or whatever. Our soul already is familiar with all that stuff. So rationalism definitely is connected to that Platonic thought. The mind is full of this rational content, inborn ideas, inborn principles, kind of like pre-installed software again. It's already there. Foundational knowledge is self-evident. You do not need any experience to understand it, and foundational truths are universal because they are part of the content of every mind. There's no people who would disagree that 3 + 2 = 5. If somebody disagrees with that, they probably have something wrong with their mind. They probably are a little bit insane, or a lot insane. Now, British empiricists, we will talk about next week in particular. So we already touched on Hobbes and a little bit on Bacon. Next week we'll talk about Locke, Berkeley, and Hume. The next chapter is completely on Hume, but it mentions Locke and Berkeley a little bit. But I do want to spend more time on Locke and Berkeley because they are kind of interesting and important. Now again, it's called British empiricism. It's mainly concentrated in England, Ireland, and Scotland. On the British Isles, genuine knowledge has foundation in experience only. So the idea is we are born as a completely blank tablet, tabula rasa, and there's nothing there, no pre-installed software of any kind. Once we are born, we start getting all this information from the world around us, and this is how it gets into the system. Otherwise, there's nothing. All knowledge about the world is only probable. This is also important because note that if everything you know you get from experience, you can never be completely sure about anything because experience can be deceptive. And this is one of the things with which Descartes will be also trying to deal with this question. It's based on experience. Some ideas seem to be universal, but that's merely an illusion. Why is it an illusion? Well, because we all have the same experience. So naturally we will agree about certain things. But that's not because it is some sort of, parallel reality type of fundamental thing which we have some sort of access to in a previous life or whenever it is. Okay, so now to Descartes. Descartes is a very interesting person. He was born March 31st, 1596, so he is a little bit younger than Hobbes, although he actually lived less than Hobbes because he only lived for about 54 years. Small town, La Haye. Interestingly enough, they are very proud in this little town that it was a birthplace of Descartes, so they renamed it. And today, if you look at the map of France, or at least bigger map because it's still fairly small, you'll find a town called Descartes, and that is actually what used to be La Haye. But the funny thing is, Descartes never lived there. After he was born there, he was taken away by his parents, and he did not spend any time in this town whatsoever. Nonetheless, because he was born there, they're very proud. They have his little museum. Then he got an education from the Jesuit college La Flèche. He was given there at a fairly early age, and it's kind of like college which first serves as type of a school and then gives type of more of a university education. It was specifically given by the French king to the Jesuits. Who are the Jesuits? Jesuits are actually some of the toughest Catholics there is. This is the Catholics who thought that Catholic Church is not Catholic enough. So they decided to become even more Catholic than the Catholic Church itself. Remember we talked about Protestant movement which was criticizing Catholic Church for being corrupt. Well, Jesuits, in a sense, also start by saying Catholic Church is, if not corrupt, then at least has its problems. But instead of suggesting that it should become less Catholic and have a Bible in English and so on, the Jesuits suggested it should be even more Catholic. That's the way to go. That a little bit explains some of the things about Descartes too. He inherited quite a bit of money. His mother died when he was very, very young, as you probably learned if you read the book. Then his father died, left him some money, so he could actually do a lot of things with his life. He decided to experience life. He joined an army as a type of a volunteer, wanted to see what that's like. Then he had these 3 dreams, which supposedly gave him a push to become a philosopher. On November 10th, 1619, the vision of his mission in life. What did he decide his mission in life was? To find the key to the mysteries of nature in a new philosophy based on mathematical reason. Remember, we also mentioned last time that Galileo was one of the first who started using mathematics to explain the movements of planets and so on. Now, that was around the same time, Galileo even a little bit later, but mathematics was becoming more and more part of the scientific exploration. And Descartes accepted it wholeheartedly too. Hobbes also accepted it. So for him, it became clear that mathematics is the way to go. That's how you can really know things. Now, just how his life ended, that's also in the book, kind of a sad story. He was still fairly young, you may say. Well, you guys probably don't think it's that young, and about 53, 1649, but still, it wasn't that old. Queen of Sweden invited him to come to Stockholm, and he lived in Holland at the time, to become her private tutor, tutoring her about philosophy. She also promised him that she will give him an academy and so on, and he was stupid enough to accept that. Turned out to be a very bad idea. Why was it a bad idea? Because the queen was very demanding. She expected him to get up in the morning and gave her lectures at 5 a.m. for whatever reason. But Descartes was kind of a laid-back kind of guy. He enjoyed his lazy lifestyle. He was sleeping late. He would go to bed late. He didn't work anywhere prior to that. So naturally to him it was very, very difficult. It did not help that it was winter, and Sweden is quite a bit colder than continental Europe. The winter in Stockholm can get quite cold, so he became so miserable that he caught pneumonia and died. So that's how his life ended, February 11, 1650. Now let's look at his philosophy a little bit closer. So the 3 goals, you may say, Descartes actually had was, for one thing, to find certainty. This is very important in his project, and very often students misunderstand a little bit what he is doing because he thinks he's just questioning everything and basically does not believe anything. That is not what he's trying to do. He's questioning everything not in order to doubt it, but in order to find certainty. That's what he wanted to find. He says, so many things I was taught as a student when I was at this Jesuit college. And turns out many of them don't seem true to me. It seems like there's so many falsehoods about this stuff. Probably partially he means the Aristotle's teachings, which they were still telling students. And remember, for Aristotle, many things, especially related to the way planets work and astronomy and so on, were very, very weird and not how science tells us things are. He thought it was a separate sphere where these separate type of bodies exist, not like what we have on Earth and so on. But by this time, science already suggested this is not the case. And since science suggested this is not the case, for many people it became problematic. They thought, well, what they teaching us now in university doesn't sound true at all. There is this new scientific discoveries which actually reject all that. but obviously it's very difficult to accept all these new ideas, especially for higher education and so on, because professors usually teach stuff they learned when they were students themselves and so on. So this kind of a system is slow to change, and especially since the church was also preventing this kind of changes. Remember, we talked about it last time. So he wanted to develop completely new universal science, something which would explain everything and work on these scientific foundations. Nonetheless, he wanted to avoid the trap into which he thought people like Hobbes were falling. What was the trap? The trap was to basically suggest that everything is working like a clock, everything works on this mechanistic scientific principles, and therefore there's no freedom of the will, and even, you may suggest, no God, because again, like, the role of God was becoming less and less prominent. Prior to that, people thought God is responsible for everything, and then it turns out there's these laws of physics. Things start getting explained by the laws of physics rather than by God. So it was kind of leading people towards atheism. Hobbes was accused of atheism, even though he says that there is God and so on. But when you read his work, you can't help but think that, is this guy an atheist? What he says really sounds very atheistic. And so even though he was making all these excuses and saying, no, I still believe in God, but many people did not believe him. They thought he just doesn't want to acknowledge the fact that he is an atheist so that he would not be prosecuted. Remember what happened to Galileo? I'm sure if Hobbes didn't want to get into this kind of trouble either. So Descartes was trying to avoid all that. Now, Meditations on the First Philosophy is probably his most famous work. They are written for general public. They are written in a very, very accessible language, and they're kind of cool. You may just say they are very cool in a way. What he is doing there is he uses this method of doubt. He starts by saying, some years ago I was struck by a large number of falsehoods that I have accepted as true in my childhood. I realized that it was necessary once in the course of my life to demolish everything completely and start again right from the foundations. So he compares it to a basket of apples. Suppose you have a basket of apples and some of them are bad apples. So he says, how do you find the bad apples? Well, one way you can start digging into the basket, but as we all know, that could be problematic, because what will happen then is you will dig out certain apples but miss some other ones, bad apples. What's the better way? He says the better way is to take out all the apples, good and bad ones, and then when you put them back, inspect them one by one. That way you can be absolutely sure that you did not miss anything. So this is what he suggests doing. He's saying, let me find first this kind of Archimedean point. Now, what is an Archimedean point? Well, Archimedes supposedly was saying that if he is given a particular lever, he can turn the entire world around, as long as he can grab onto something, right? So this one thing which you can not doubt at all. So Descartes is saying, let us, for experiment's sake, suggest that everything is a complete deception. And matrix here again, our good old example with matrix is a good way to compare it. Even though he never watched Matrix, but I'm sure Matrix is partially based on this idea too. He's saying, suppose everything is a deception. Absolutely everything is a deception. There is no world. We think there is a world, but there isn't. Just like in Matrix, they were swimming in this liquid, right? And wires were attached to their head. Suppose everything is just this simulation. Somebody, he calls it evil demon, is feeding it into your head. In the Matrix, those were the agents, right? But he says evil demon. Suppose this evil demon is feeding you bad information. Is there absolutely anything at all you can be sure about? Well, if you guys read the chapter or heard about Descartes, you probably know. So what does he actually say? What is this one thing you can be absolutely sure about? Okay. Well, we'll get there. But anyway, so again, to emphasize, like when I had students write an essay, many students just say, okay, he was just doubting everything. He wasn't doubting really anything. He was trying to find things which you do not doubt. So this is what is known as methodic doubt. It's a strategy of deliberately doubting everything in order to find certain things, something which you can be sure about. So this is kind of like against thought experiment, instrumental. The point there is to find certainty, not to doubt. Well, yes, that's the thing. I think, therefore I am. That is the answer. You can be absolutely sure about at least one thing. You are doing the thinking. By this very question, the questioning, the fact that you exist or everything exists, well, who's doing the questioning? There got to be somebody. The evil demon or the agents or whoever can deceive you about the world, they cannot deceive you about the fact that you exist. Because somebody has to be asking these questions. And whoever asks these questions is you. That certainly is something you can be sure about, right? Can you see that? There's no way to doubt this much. Note that it doesn't necessarily explain to you what you are, but it does tell you that at least something that is there, and that something is you. Okay, so that is his Archimedean point. He doubts everything else. He doubts, first of all, of course, ordinary sense experience. He says, well, I think I am sitting in a chair now in front of the fire, but am I? It's possible that I am deceived about that. So he did not, at the time they did not have the movies such as Matrix, but like I said, that's probably where the Matrix got the idea. You may be thinking that you are in front of the fire, but you may not be. And one of the examples he actually brings is when you're dreaming. Sometimes you have such vivid dreams that you are thinking that you actually are doing something, and then only when you wake up you discover that it was a dream. So he's saying, how come it's not possible that what you are doing now is also a dream? And then you will wake up from that stuff. Okay, so sense experience is in doubt. He's saying that's one of those apples which has to be taken out. Note that he's not saying yet that it doesn't exist. He's just saying you have legitimate right to doubt it exists. Now, even the most vivid stuff, such as belief that you are in particular location and so on. But he goes further than that. He says, even stuff like 2 + 3 = 5 can be doubted. You may wonder, how is that possible that you doubt that? Well, he says, what if this evil demon deceives you so much that you're thinking every single time you think 2 + 3, you think 5, but that actually is wrong. That actually is some sort of twisted reality, falsehood created by this evil demon. So even that can be wrong. Okay, so what do you do then? Well, like I said, the first point he finds is the famous cogito. Cogito ergo sum. That's in Latin, just basically means I think, therefore I am. Somebody has to be doing the thinking. So this is his Archimedean point, but note that it actually doesn't give you very much, does it? Because you still don't know if anything else exists. How do you prove everything exists? Starting from that. Well, this is how Descartes himself progresses. If he okay, before we get to how he progresses, one more thing. He actually identifies himself with the process of thinking. He says, I am then only a thing that thinks, that is, I am a mind. And this is important because he kind of creates this division at this point when he separates himself as a mind from his body. Why? He says, well, I can doubt my body, but I cannot doubt my mind. I cannot doubt the fact that I am thinking, but I can doubt the fact that I have the body. So to him at this point already these are two separate things, the mind and the body. The mind, you may say, is spiritual substance, and the body is the physical substance. So he separates that. He says they are different. Why are they different? Well, because I can doubt one thing, but I cannot doubt the other thing. Okay. Now, if he stops at this point, now it would be solipsism. What is solipsism? Solipsism is basically the idea that there is no reality outside your mind whatsoever. If somebody says, okay, I know I exist, but that's as much as I can go, I don't even know if all these people exist. Maybe this is all some sort of simulation. That's solipsism. This is how far he gets with his cogito. But he does not want to stop there, because he actually wants to find a way to prove that everything exists, to find other stuff. So how does he get from solipsism to something else? Well, actually, in a very interesting way. He starts looking at his mind and finding stuff there. What is in his mind? What can you find in your mind without looking outside of yourself? And the important idea which he discovers in his mind, which helps him, is the idea of God. He says, I have an idea of God. That's in my head. Now, again, that is an interesting part where you may disagree with him or agree with him. He says that, well, I can then distinguish certain things as truly existent as long as they are clear and distinct. Whatever I perceive clearly and distinctly is true. So I can go with this natural light, and then this natural light will help me towards the truth. In opposition to mere impulses. Impulses can lead me astray. But if I only accept what is very clear and distinct with this natural light, then everything is good. So he progresses in this way. Again, at the objects around him, he's saying, well, there's a wax. I have peaks of wax, but if I warm it up, it becomes like liquid, right? Wax becomes liquid. So is it wax? Is it not wax? I still don't really know. But how can I be sure there's anything even there? Again, like I said, that is where God helps him. He finds this idea of God in his head, and God serves to him as a guarantor of truth. Because God is the first principle. God is something which kind of assures him that everything, including the world, exists. This is kind of very important point for Descartes. And again, remember, like I said at the beginning, he was educated by those Jesuits who are very Catholic. He was Catholic, so naturally he was not an atheist by any means. He still wants to do it in a scientific way, but God is an important element in his philosophy. Okay, so he thought that he actually can prove the existence of God because he has the idea of God, and he goes on to do that, and at this point he switches from epistemology. Remember, epistemology is how do we know things, questions of knowledge, to metaphysics, to questions what actually really exists, what is the reality. Okay, so the idea of God. This is his first proof of the existence of God. Note that he does not go the same way as Aquinas did, because he still does not have any proof that the world exists. So he cannot use all these proofs which Aquinas was suggesting, such as we observe movement around us, therefore there must be first mover. No, we observe movement, but that can be a lie. So how do you prove the existence of God without looking at the world? This is how he is doing that. He says the idea of God as a perfect being could not have come anywhere but from God. my perception of the infinite is in some way prior to my perception of the finite, which is myself. Now, to us it may be a little strange, but to him it made perfect sense. He says, I could not have made up the idea of God. I couldn't do it. You may ask, how come? Why not? Well, because God is such a perfect being that the idea of this kind of perfection just could not have been spontaneously generated by whatever I observe. Because everything I observe is not perfect, but God is perfect. He compares it at one point with a child who has this idea of a very complex mechanism, like you may say a computer today, right? Suppose a child, a 5-year-old child, has this idea of a very sophisticated computer, and you're saying, where would he get it? He cannot learn it himself. He must have gotten it from somewhere else. Where would you get it from? From God himself. He's saying it's like God left an imprint on our mind, a stamp of the authorship, that he created us. That's how we have the idea of God. The perfection, the most perfect, the best thing. Now, once he actually proves the idea of God, or at least he thinks he proved it, everything becomes somewhat easier. So again, just to lay out his argument in steps, this is how the first argument goes. Something cannot be derived from nothing. That is a kind of thing everybody will agree. If you have nothing, where would something come from? There must be at least as much reality in the cause as in the effect. That is actually one of those scholastic principles. It is a little bit strange what he is using it, given that he wants to break away from these old ways of thinking, but I guess it is harder than you would imagine. The old ways of thinking, the way you were taught in school, they are somewhere in there in your mind. So he actually accepts that. He thinks that there has to be at least as much reality in the cause as in the effect. Now the idea of God, which he has, is infinite and perfect being. So the finite and imperfect being, which is a human being, could not have created this idea. It has to come from God, who is infinite and perfect. Now, that's basically how he proves the existence of God. Now let's discuss this a little bit. So he claims that the ideas of perfection and infinity could not be derived from experience. Do you agree with that? Just want to mention one more time. Keep in mind, everything you do online is immediately registered. I know how many sessions you attend, how many times you interact, all of this in your statistics. So if I decide the final grade and look at your statistics, I will know exactly what you've been doing the entire semester. So for some of you that could make a difference. I would suggest that you do pay attention. I can't see all of you, it's not like in the classroom, but nonetheless it does have consequences. Anyway, so we have 8 answers. 8 people are paying attention, 7 of them agree, 1 does not agree. Okay, now let me ask the person who doesn't agree. Why don't you agree with that? Well, Hume will actually give his answer. He would say, well, for one thing, we really don't have an idea of perfection. Do you know what perfection is? Can somebody imagine, for example, a perfect car? What is that? I mean, you can always think of a car which is better than the one you currently have. But what's the perfect car? Perfect meaning the best ever. There's nothing better than that. Is there such thing? I mean, you can just constantly add to what you already have. You can imagine something better than what you have, or something better than what you've even seen, right? But can you imagine something perfect, meaning there's nothing better than that? And Hume would actually say, no, that's a self-deception. If you think you have this idea, you are sadly mistaken. That would be his answer. So, while you may think that you understand perfection, well, you understand the word perfection, which basically means the best ever. But trying to imagine what perfection is, well, I can't. And I don't know if you guys can. So that basically is one of the criticisms of what Descartes is doing. Now, another criticism is the famous Cartesian circle. Note that in order for him to get out of this problem, he used God as a guarantor of truth. But how did he prove the existence of God? He actually went in a type of a circular way. He says, well, there has to be at least something true. So essentially, there has to be at least something true, therefore it is God. And since God is there, therefore there are things which are true. That is a more or less explanation of what Cartesian circle is in plain way. So if God is a guarantor of your clear and distinct perception, how can you use a clear and distinct perception to prove the existence of God? Right? That's the question. Now, Descartes himself kind of tries to address it, because actually after he published his work, he got some responses from some of the people, including Hobbes, by the way. Hobbes wrote one of the replies, and then the way it is published, actually, it has the replies, and then he replies to all the replies. So it's kind of like this, one of the first blogs, you might say. He posted his entry, right? And then he got comments from some users in modern language, and then he commented in response. So he does respond to their criticism, and one of the criticisms right away was this, like, does it seem circular? You're using God to prove the truth, and the truth is the proof of God. You say, well, no, actually, you can clearly and distinctly perceive certain things, and you don't need God for that. You need God as just the guarantor of the fact that you have this entire chain of reasoning, the longer chain of reasoning. So, for example, in math you have proofs, right? Some of them are very long. So each element of the proof, something you may start from 3 plus 2 equal 5. Now that you don't need God in order to clearly perceive that this is true. But the whole proof itself, to be able to get from this through like multiple steps to whatever final proof you have, for that you need God. Otherwise, you would not be able to understand the whole thing. Now, whether, again, it makes sense, well, that's another question here. But he thought that's how it is explained. So how is error then possible? That's another question, right? If God is guarantor of truth, God is all-powerful. How come there's some mistakes? I mean, we're not always getting everything right. So, therefore what? Is God still sometimes deceives us? No. Descartes answers to this. He says, that's because our will is too wide. Our will is wider than our intellect. So this is the quote, how he answers this. He says, so what then is the source of my mistakes? It must be simply this. The scope of the will is wider than the scope of the intellect. But instead of restricting it within the same limits, I extend its use to matters which I do not understand. Since the will is different in such cases, it easily turns aside from what is true and good, and this is the source of my errancy. So in other words, our will allows us to make mistakes. Our will is such that we can just go the wrong way. That's the idea. Now, he also mentions again, he kind of gives in the same word the second proof of God, just in case if the first one didn't work. And this is the one we already heard. This is the ontological argument from Anselm of Canterbury. Remember, Aquinas actually rejected that. What is the ontological argument? Once again, that's the argument that we know God exists by definition. God is the most perfect being, and if you have God which doesn't exist and God which exists, which one is more perfect? Well, the one which exists, because if he doesn't exist, he's not perfect then. Now, Aquinas again rejected that. He thought only learned people can truly understand it, but Descartes thinks that's a good argument. he says that argument actually works pretty well. The book goes into more detail about why he thinks this way. If you're interested, you can read it. But nonetheless, so 2 proofs of the existence of God. He thinks that's more than enough. We are done here. But there's still a problem, because what about the body? How do we know body exists? How do we know the world is real, right? He knows that he exists. He knows there is God. Now that actually is easy. Or at least he thinks it's easy. Why is it easy? Because he proven the existence of God, which is perfect and absolutely good. And so, therefore, the experience we have cannot be a lie. God would never lie to us. So the experience, at least in general, the world around us, which also comes from God, has to be true. This evil genius which he invented at the beginning, that's again, he does not believe there is an evil genius which deceives us. He just used it as a possibility, saying, for argument's sake, let us suppose there is an evil genius. At this point, note that he actually rejected that completely. He came to the conclusion that there's no evil genius, there's only all-powerful God, who also is absolutely good, and who actually guarantees the reality of the world. So this is how the entire meditation basically goes. A perfect God cannot lie to us, therefore he is not a deceiver, therefore everything exists. Now, here's the question. Interesting question. If there was no world, and God was to tell us that there is, would he be a deceiver? Why would he be a deceiver in this case? What do you guys think? So imagine there is no world. It's all an illusion. Would you say God is lying to you? It's also interesting because when we talk about Berkeley, that will be very directly related to Berkeley. No, why do you think not? Why do you think yes? So again, taking Matrix as our example. Remember, in Matrix, the people were lied to. If you guys watched it, or if you didn't watch, they were swimming in this liquid. The evil agents were feeding them information about the world. But why was it a lie? What made it a lie? Yes, exactly. That is the whole point, because in Matrix there were 2 worlds, right? There was the true world, and in this true world they were swimming in liquid. And this is where what's his name woke up. But there was also this fake world, different from that. And this is the world they thought is the real one. So in this world, which was fake, they were going to work, they were doing all sorts of things. But in true world, they also existed. However, they were swimming in liquid. Note that if there is God who is feeding us kind of an illusion of the world, that's the only world. There's no other world. We're not swimming in liquid. There's no liquid. Right? So it's not a deception then. The illusionary world, being the only world there is, would be the truth. The truth would be the illusion. There's really would not be any difference, because there's nothing any more real than that. So that's the answer. Yes, that's the only world. You can't say it's a lie. How is it a lie? There's nothing else. So even though it is an illusion, but that illusion is reality. Okay, so that's basically the answer to this question. Descartes actually doesn't think so. He thinks it would be a lie, but now finally the mind-body relation, the famous dualism. Note we already mentioned that. So he actually makes the distinction. He says there are mental substances, which is, you may say, our soul, our mind, and physical substances, which is matter. Why does he even need this distinction? Well, it's very simple, really, because remember what the problem was for Hobbes and for other people who completely believe in science. How can you explain human will then? What is this will we have? How can you explain even God? If everything is material and everything follows laws of physics, then we all determined. Then there's nothing we can do. And this is what Hobbes said. He said, yes, we are completely determined. But if we are completely determined, that leads you to a very, very drastic conclusions. You basically can say, for example, if somebody murders somebody, well, you can't hold him responsible. Why not? Well, he was determined. That's the laws of physics, right? So somebody in a court, if they accuse him of crime, can say, hey, man, I'm not guilty at all. Why? Well, it's all physics, you know. The chemical processes in my brain, I have no control over them. How can I have control? It's all determined by the laws of chemistry and physics. But that seems wrong, isn't it? So then we can't blame anybody. If people commit crimes, we can just say, well, that's physics. What can you do? It seems wrong. There's just something completely wrong about that. And so this is the way to explain it, right? There is physical world, and the physical world is completely determined. But there is also spiritual world, the world where our mind kind of exists. And that world is not determined at all. It's not obeying the laws of physics. There are no laws of physics in that world where our mind exists. Okay, that famous mind-body dualism, which he created, is discussed again in philosophy over and over again. We call it even Cartesian dualism, Descartes, Cartesian, in his honor. And it creates problem of its own now. It may solve one problem, but it creates another problem, and it's a problem of interaction, because immediately many people said, okay, so there's this spiritual world, your mind is in spiritual world, there's this physical world, how do they interact? So when your mind, which is purely spiritual, tells you you should raise your hand, how the hell does that happen? If you think about it, it's not as easy as you would imagine. There should be a point where a non-physical substance interacts with the physical substance. How does it do that? If it's non-physical, how can it? Descartes thought that he had an answer. Pineal gland in our brain, they actually thought that this is the point where your soul kind of interacts with your body. Now, needless to say, scientific discoveries after this point, we know a lot more about the brain. Pineal gland has nothing to do with that. And even if it did, it still wouldn't really explain it, because, I mean, then the question is, what is the pineal gland? Is it a physical object? Okay, then how the hell can it interact with the spiritual stuff? Is it spiritual? Excellent. How can it then be physical? That creates a rather large problem, because once you separate this world so much, it's actually not easy to put them back together. Some of his followers suggested kind of a very interesting idea. They said, well, how about this? God, who knows everything, arranges things such that when we think we are interacting with physical objects, we actually don't, but he has this kind of prearranged system when it happens simultaneously. So you think you are lifting the pencil, but you're not. Actually, God lifts the pencil. But because God knows your thoughts, he arranges things so that it looks like you do. So God is actually interacting with both worlds, but you don't. It's one of the ways to try to solve it, but whether it works or not, that's a different question. Otherwise, you may still hit the same problem. How do they interact? And there is no really good answer to this. We will see how some philosophers later tried to escape this, but it's not as easy as you would think. Now, how about modern approaches? What do we think about it today? Well, if you actually take philosophy of mind, that's one of the classes which goes into more detail about it, you would know that there is one of the approaches is reductionism and non-reductionism. So reductionists say that all sciences can be reduced to physics. But there is an objection to that. the famous objection by John Searle in particular. What did John Searle say in his paper written in 1980? He called it Chinese room experiment. And this is how he actually explains why we can't think of ourselves as being completely like machines, reductionism. Okay, so here's how he explains that. He says, suppose that there is a room, right? Imagine a room, and imagine there is a person in that room. Lovely. Okay, there are two windows or two holes on both sides. Inside the room, other than the person, there is also a set of instructions. Now, from one window, somebody hands him a note which is in Chinese language. It has this kind of, Chinese writing there, something like this. I don't know how to do Chinese, but let's say that is in Chinese. Suppose it says something like, how do I get to the cinema? So he hands him a note. The guy in the room does not speak Chinese language, does not understand this note. But he looks up the instruction, and the instruction tells him, if you see a note which looks like this, hand out the note which looks like this. Let's suppose this is also in Chinese, and let's suppose that one says, you go straight 100 yards and then you turn right. So he hands it over from this window. Now you see what's going on. The guy does not speak Chinese. People outside the box though think he does. When they give him a note in Chinese which asks for direction to the theater, they get a note which explains how to get to the theater. Now similarly, if you think about a robot or a machine or a computer, this is what they do. They follow the instructions. They do not think on their own. They have this pre-installed software. The software tells them what to do. If you know anything about computers, this is exactly how they work. The computer gets certain input. It knows, the program tells the computer what to do if you got this input, then computer responds. If you make a robot, let's say you say, hello robot. The robot will follow the instruction which it received from the creator, and he will say, hello mister, how is your day going? But he's not going to understand what the hell he's doing. So this is actually the criticism which John Searle says about reductionism. We all are inside that box. Each and every one is a human being. And we actually know there's more to this story than just following the instruction. Okay, so that's basically the answer to this. Now what do you guys think? Let's discuss this. Can we exist without the body? Is there life after death? Does this story actually convince you? Let's do another poll. Can we exist without the body? Yes or no? Okay, well this time we got 9 responses. I guess that's enough. So 3 people think no, 6 people think yes. Well, that probably is largely depends on whether you believe in some sort of religious belief or not, because that's what most people base it on. But note that Descartes obviously would say yes, and this is how he tries to prove it. It's a very big question in philosophy in general. Obviously, it's never completely answered, but the difference between the way religion approaches it and the philosophy is obviously in religion, if you believe, you believe, and the story, just read the Bible, it tells you. But in philosophy, we actually do question that. We actually try to figure out whether that is indeed the fact or not. Why are you convinced by Descartes' arguments? What do you think about what Descartes was doing? Okay, but Descartes' argument in general is not really about whether we are alive or not. It's more about reality of the world and existence of God. So what he's trying to do again is to prove to us that despite science, despite what science tells us, and is convincing as that maybe there's more to this story than that. His project essentially, he was a believer in science. He actually gave quite a bit of a push to science itself because he was one of the first who started using in mathematics all this to unknown quantity x, y, z, and so on. Some of the first mathematical equations. This is his work. He not only believed in science, he was trying to advance science himself. Nonetheless, he also believed in God, and he thought that it was perfectly compatible. Now, whether or not he convinced with his philosophy, whether he convinced you or not, that's the question. Was he actually successful in his argument, starting from this cogito and so on? It would really help if you read the chapter 2, because otherwise, like I said, it may be more difficult to understand just me talking or just the reading by itself rather than in combination. Okay, well, fair enough. Well, like I said, there's a lot of debate. Some people definitely think he was successful, but many people disagree. They disagreed right away. Like I said, all these replies from Hobbes in particular and from other people, including people who believe in God, thought that what he was doing was wrong. Many people who actually are religious thought that his entire project was really, really bad. They did not like it. Why didn't they like it? They said that, again, if you start using your reasoning, questioning everything the way he did, you are a lot more likely to eventually become an atheist than to believe in God, because he thinks he is doing a good job proving it. But their response is not really. And by doing a bad job trying to prove the existence of God, you are doing a disservice to God, which is much worse than if you never questioned him in the first place. So this is one of the responses he was getting. But many other people actually disagreed and thought that what he did was fairly successful. So the debate is still going on, but you will see in this class too, when we get closer to our time, there are some better attempts to answer all this question, at least in my opinion and in many other philosophers' opinion. Kant in particular, his approach is more sophisticated and perhaps will convince more people that there is a possibility of putting it together, keeping the freedom of the will, keeping the idea of God, and yet in the same time explaining science and explaining reality. But some people just say, let's not touch this whatsoever, let's just believe in God, and that is separate from all these troubles. But as philosophers, we can't do that. If we do that, then we no longer are philosophers. We really have to question that stuff. Okay, so next week we will have David Hume, chapter 10. Make sure you do the reading. Please, please, please do the reading. And by the way, you may think I don't know. Of course I know. I can look up what you are doing on MindTap 2. I have all the statistics. So if you are not doing readings, I will find out. And in the end, when I start getting emails, when it's really like a couple of days before final grades, there's a lot more people who suddenly wake up to the reality that they may not be getting the grade they want and suddenly want to write papers and do whatever. But by then it is too late. What you should do is right now. So if there is a borderline case about your grade, there may be no extra credit for doing the reading, but there may be a situation when you have 89.9% or something, and it's between B minus and C plus, and or rather B plus and A minus, and then whether or not you get A minus or B plus will be decided by what did you do throughout the class. So don't take it for granted. There are readings every week. They're not very big, you have to do them. Chapter 10, and then make sure you do the homework and quiz for this chapter, chapter 9, which again would be a lot easier if you actually do the reading. And again, it's due March 14th, this Sunday at 11:59 p.m. And on Monday we will start talking about not Hume yet, but Locke, who is next one after Hobbes in British empiricism. A lot closer to our modern thinking, and he also is considered kind of a key figure in Western liberalism. This is where what we consider liberal philosophy takes off. So interesting stuff. Make sure you are prepared. Otherwise, I guess that's all we have. We have still 2 minutes, unless you have any kind of questions.